We're out here today to do some ear counts. It's a great time of the year to evaluate where you end up on your final ear count. So out in the field, measure off your thousandths of an acre. So in this case, we're in 30-inch rows, so I got my tape stretched out 17 feet 5 inches. What we're going to do is go through and count the number of plants that we have. And while we go through there, I also count the number of ears that we have, good, uniform, full harvestable ears. So as we go through here, you'll see that some of them I might count as no ear at all, or I'll maybe give one a half an ear. So here's an example of what I would call a half an ear. I'm certainly going to get this in the combine, but when I look at the individual plant yield here, there's no comparison to what it could be compared to a good ear like this. So this is still going to be hurting as far as my overall ear count goes. So let's go ahead and see what we have here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 18. So I ended up with 34,000 plants here, and I ended up with 30,500 ears. So the ones that weren't counting toward my ear count is an example of one like this, where I obviously have no ear at all, or a very, very small ear like I have in this case here. So again, this is going against my ear count. So I had 2 full ears that were not part of my ear count, and then I had 2 half ears, or those ears that I know I can get in the combine, but are certainly a lot smaller when you start to look at the individual plant yield. So on average, a lot of fields we've been walking the last few weeks, it's pretty common to have 3,000 to 4,000 off on your ear counts compared to where we had hoped to be. So I really want you to get out to the fields and do some evaluations so you're not surprised when you get out there with a combine on what your final ear count is. This happens to be in an irrigated field, so where we don't have any of the extra added moisture stress, so we're going to be able to hold on to a lot of the smaller plants in comparison to maybe what you would in a dry land field. But once you see what your ear count loss is, the next thing is trying to investigate, why or where's the ear count loss coming from. So there's 2 main places we lose ear count. One would be in plant spacing. So if you don't have uniform plant to plant spacing, if you have what we call a double drop or 2 plants close together, or what we call a misplaced seed, meaning that we had seed tube bounce or ricochet in the seed tube and that plant got off a little bit in its spacing. Doubles and misplaced seeds will hurt your ear count. Of course, if you had any skips from last spring, which is pretty common, that's hurting your ear count as well. But then the other thing that can affect ear count is what we call the photocopied side or lady mergers. So if all these plants don't come up at the same time, the plant gets behind. We can see that in this example where I pulled this ear off here. If we come down to the bottom here, what we want to look for is the diameter of the stalks. So we're looking for the diameter of the stalks. Most of the stalks out here are this nice good diameter, and then I see that I got this skinny stalk. This skinny stalk didn't happen in July or August. This happened back at the time of germination and emergence. This plant came up later in comparison to its neighbors. And when you start to see the effect it can have on overall plant yield, it can be pretty big. So in some cases, maybe you don't lose the ear totally, but if it's affecting ear size, it's still costing you. So another thing to look for when you're doing your ear counts is just look for uniformity in the ear size itself. So again, this is an ear I can probably get into the combine, but when I look at the individual plant yield, it's just not there in comparison. So try to figure out what your ear count is. If you're losing ears, why? Is it spacing problems, or is it going back to these lady mergers? If it is a lady merger, then you're going to have to do some investigating. You can dig up your plant, and the first thing I always look for would be checking the planting depth. So what's the planting depth of this plant compared to its neighbor? Remember, a 1/4 inch difference in planting depth can be the difference between a good ear and no ear at all. If it's not a planting depth problem, then we can take it back to the microenvironment. As you dig that up, do you see any residue that's been pinched in there? So pinched residue can affect uniformity of the germination of this seed and get this plant behind. If it's not pinched residue, it's not planting depth, then it's going to tell us it's going to go back to something about that microenvironment around the seed. Now today it would be tough to determine what that is, but it's things with that planting pass, like setting down pressure, how your closing wheels are set, are your gauge wheels set properly, and a whole list of things that deal with the planting pass. So really recommend spend the next couple of weeks out in your fields, do some stand counts and ear counts, see what your stand is compared to your ears, and see what kind of loss you're having and try to figure out where the loss is coming from. Remember, every 1,000 ears per acre is worth 5 to 7 bushel. So if you're losing 4,000 ears an acre, you're losing 20 to 28 bushel per acre just in ear count alone. So get out and do some checks.